History is not just a story of kings and battles. It is the story of us, of humans who endured hunger, cold, fear, and faith. From the frozen huts of forgotten villages to the thrones of power and rebellion, every age echoes with survival. In the 10th century, the northern winds ruled the land. Viking settlements along the fjords of Scandinavia faced winters that could kill within hours. Homes were built low into the earth, turf-covered and narrow, trapping every ounce of heat. Inside, families slept shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in furs stiff with frost. Children learned early that warmth was not comfort, it was survival. The fire was sacred. Every night, embers were buried in ash, not to die, but to live until morning. They called this ritual keeping the soul of the fire. To eat, they dried fish, fermented shark, and boiled bones until the broth turned white. Every breath was precious, every sunrise a victory. When storms buried the village, their songs echoed beneath the snow. Hymns of gods and giants, courage and kinship. They were not just warriors, they were survivors of the endless night. Paris, 1789. The scent of revolution was stronger than perfume. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was once adored. A living portrait of grace and luxury. But outside the palace gates, hunger screamed louder than music. Bread riots spread through the streets. Rumors painted her as heartless. "Let them eat cake," they whispered, though she never said it. As the French Revolution rose like fire, the Queen's world turned to ash. Her jewels were confiscated, her allies scattered, her husband, the king, executed. In the cold prison of the Conciergerie, she wrote her final letters, not to kings, but to her children. Her last morning, October 16, 1793, she dressed simply, no crown, no silk, only courage. When the blade fell, silence filled the square. But history did not bury her. It remembered her, not as a villain or saint, but as a mirror of her age, a world breaking free from monarchy and from illusion. In 1857, India trembled under the weight of empire. For over a century, the British East India Company ruled with profit and powder. But in the barracks of Mira, something was changing. A whisper, a refusal. The sepoys, Indian soldiers serving the British crown, were given new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. A sacrilege to both Hindu and Muslim faiths. What began as outrage became defiance. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Delhi, Kanpur, Jhansi. Ordinary men became warriors, and among them rose a woman who defied every law of fear, Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. Riding into battle with her infant son strapped to her back, she became a symbol of resistance, the queen who fought till her last breath. Though the uprising was crushed, it marked the beginning of something greater, a movement that would, decades later, free a nation. Empires fall not in a single war, but in the hearts of those who refuse to kneel. In the red deserts of Jordan lies a city carved from stone, Petra, the Rose City. 2,000 years ago, it pulsed with life, gold, and caravans from across Arabia. Its people, the Nabateans, built wonders without empires, temples, tombs, and water channels that turned desert into oasis. But their brilliance was also their curse. Trade routes shifted, earthquakes struck, and the sands swallowed their city. For centuries, Petra was forgotten, a ghost in the rocks. Then in 1812, a Swiss explorer named Johann Burckhardt disguised himself as a Bedouin and rediscovered the city's hidden gates. He wrote, "I saw a valley enclosed by cliffs, and within it, columns and palaces carved from living stone." Today, Petra stands silent. Its red walls whisper of time, water, and the fleeting nature of power. The desert reclaims all things, but not memory. From frozen villages to fallen queens, from rebellion to rediscovery, the thread remains the same. Humanity survives. We build, we break, we rise again. Every ruin is a story, every scar a lesson. And when the world forgets, history remembers. Echoes of humanity. Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night journey through questionable hygiene, chronic dampness, and the eternal struggle to not freeze to death before sunrise. Tonight we're talking about medieval peasants, the unsung experts of doing more with less, especially when it came to surviving winter. So dim the lights, get cozy under a blanket that hopefully doesn't smell like wet wool, and let's drift back about 800 years to a world where central heating meant sleeping next to your cow. Because yes, that was a real thing. Picture it, somewhere in rural England around the year 1320. The sun sets at 4 in the afternoon because apparently winter just loves ruining everyone's morale. You've spent the entire day hauling firewood, feeding animals, and trying to avoid the Lord's bailiff who keeps forgetting that rent day was last week. By evening, your fingers are numb, your boots are soggy, and you're ready for bed, which sounds cozy until you remember your bed is a straw mattress in a wooden hut with walls that basically whisper, "Wind, please come in." And that's before the rodents join the party. Now, medieval houses were, let's say, structurally optimistic. Most were made of wattle and daub, which sounds fancy but basically means mud smeared over sticks. It was great for insulation if you didn't mind the occasional bug migration through the walls. The roof, thatch. A beautiful fire hazard that doubled as a bird sanctuary. You'd hear soft chirps above your head at night, which was cute until something small and feathered pooped directly onto your pillow. So how did peasants stay warm? The simple answer, they didn't really. Fireplaces existed, sure, but the chimney as we know it wasn't a thing for most peasants until the late Middle Ages. Instead, the fire burned right in the middle of the room, a small pit, maybe surrounded by stones, with the smoke just kind of floating upward and hoping for the best. This meant your entire house smelled like wood smoke, and your lungs aged 10 years by spring. But hey, at least your bread dried faster. Still, the fire was the heart of the home. Everyone huddled around it at night. People, pets, and occasionally livestock. In fact, many peasants literally brought animals indoors in winter because they generated heat. Imagine drifting off to sleep while your family's only cow breathes loudly beside you. It's like a rustic version of white noise, except warmer and slightly smellier. Now about the bed, or what passed for one. A medieval bed was often a wooden frame stuffed with straw, hay, or reeds. The richer you were, the more feathers and furs you could pile on top. Peasants? Not so much. They'd cover the straw with old cloth, wool blankets, or just more straw. And everyone shared, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes the occasional house guest, all snoozing together like a medieval cuddle pile. This wasn't just for family bonding, it was practical. Human bodies gave off warmth, and huddling together meant you might actually survive the night without turning into a peasant popsicle. Of course, the downside was lice. So many lice. If you've ever wondered why medieval people scratch themselves in paintings, that's not dramatic flair. That's realism. Once the fire was low and everyone settled in, the door would be barred. That meant placing a wooden beam across it. No locks, just wood-on-wood security. Outside, wolves howled in the dark. Inside, the air filled with the sound of snoring, creaking, and the occasional "who kicked me" moment. Midnight came early, But sleep didn't mean 8 uninterrupted hours. Back then, people often slept in 2 shifts, what historians call first sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed around 8 or 9, wake up around midnight to tend the fire, pray, or visit the chamber pot, everyone's favorite moment, and then drift off again until dawn. And honestly, that middle of the night quiet, sitting by the embers, hearing the wind against the walls, probably felt kind of magical, assuming you ignored the smell of goat. Let's talk about layers. A medieval peasant's winter wardrobe wasn't exactly runway ready. You had wool tunics, linen underclothes, and if you were lucky, a cloak made from sheepskin. Socks? Sort of. They wore cloth wrappings around their feet, sometimes stuffed with straw for extra warmth, like a DIY thermal insert, but with more hay fever. Gloves were rare, so most people just kept their hands in their sleeves. And shoes were simple leather turn shoes, which worked fine until you stepped in snow, which happened often since there wasn't exactly a plowing the road department back then. But the real MVP was wool, scratchy, smelly, and life-saving. It repelled water, held heat, and was the closest thing to a medieval miracle fabric. Now warmth doesn't just come from fires, it comes from food. And in winter, food was, let's say, limited. Most peasants lived off what they'd managed to store from autumn: grains, salted meat, root vegetables, and ale. Lots of ale. Water wasn't always safe, so they drank low-alcohol small beer throughout the day. Breakfast? Porridge or bread. Dinner? Stew. The same stew usually, simmering for days with whatever could be thrown in. This is where the phrase peasant pottage comes from. It was a bubbling cauldron of lentils, onions, cabbage, and hope. And if you thought they didn't have flavor, think again. Medieval peasants loved herbs. Anything to make boiled turnips taste slightly less like sadness. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, all vital for survival. In summer, they lived outside. In winter, half the time they lived with you. Not because peasants were animal lovers, but because warmth was warmth. A single cow could raise the temperature of a small hut by a few degrees. And considering there was no insulation, that made a difference. So yes, medieval people slept next to their livestock, and not metaphorically, literally next to them. It was like an accidental farm sleepover. The morning routine was less charming, though. Before dawn, someone had to wake up, clear the manure, relight the fire, and fetch water that was probably frozen solid. You'd think they'd at least get a day off on Sundays, but nope. Church was mandatory, and walking there in the cold meant another layer of why do we live here? Every few decades, the weather decided to throw a tantrum. Europe was in the middle of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cold spell that made winters harsher and growing seasons shorter. The frost would arrive early, crops would fail, and people, well, they'd starve. There were winters so brutal that rivers froze solid. In London, the Thames literally became a highway of ice. They held frost fairs on it, complete with food stalls, dancing, and gambling. Because apparently, if you're going to freeze, you might as well make it festive. Peasants, though, didn't have that luxury. When food ran out, they'd boil bark, eat weeds, or grind acorns into bread flour. Not exactly a 5-star diet, but enough to keep you alive. And through it all, the fire never stopped burning. As long as someone could keep a spark alive, even hidden in ashes overnight, the household endured. Fire was survival. Losing it meant death. If your fire went out, You'd run to a neighbor's house with an ember pot, literally a clay container to carry coals, and beg for a little flame to start yours again. Matches didn't exist, and flint and steel wasn't easy to use when your fingers were numb. So keeping that small, glowing heart of the home alive was a daily act of devotion. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about faith, family, and the stubborn human refusal to freeze quietly. Let's pause here and imagine it for a second. It's midnight. You're lying in a bed of straw beside your family, wrapped in layers of wool. The fire crackles faintly. Outside, snow falls against the shuttered window. Your breath fogs the air, but your hands are warm under the blanket. You hear the cow shift in the next room, the rooster mumble in its sleep. Somewhere outside, the wind carries the sound of a distant church bell. You know tomorrow means more labor, cutting wood, feeding animals, patching leaks. But for now, there's peace. Simple, rough, smoky peace. And somehow, that's enough. It's easy to think of peasants as miserable. And sure, many days were hard. But there was a rhythm to it. They understood the land, the seasons, the sky. They knew how to make things last, how to reuse everything, and how to endure what couldn't be changed. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Instagram worthy, but it worked. And maybe there's something kind of beautiful about that. No electricity, no comfort, no self-care Sundays. Just endurance and quiet appreciation for whatever warmth you could find. So next time you're lying in bed, complaining that your blanket isn't thick enough or your thermostat's acting weird, just remember, somewhere in 14th century Europe, a peasant was scraping frost off his eyebrows and muttering, "Could be worse. At least the cow's warm." So let's stay in that smoky, straw-scented medieval hut for a moment longer. The fire's crackling low, the cow's still doing her best impression of a snoring roommate, and the faint smell of smoke, mud, and humanity fills the air. Cozy, right? Well, kind of. Until you remember that no one here has bathed in about 2 months, maybe 3 if they were busy with the harvest. Welcome to the world of medieval hygiene, or more accurately, medieval strategic neglect. Now, contrary to what some people think, medieval folks didn't hate bathing. They just had a complicated relationship with it. Like someone who loves swimming but is mildly allergic to chlorine. In theory, everyone liked the idea of being clean. In practice, keeping clean was a logistical nightmare. Running water? Not really. Soap? Sort of. But it was more like a rough brick made from animal fat and ash. And warm water? Only if you felt like heating gallons of it over the fire and then lugging it to a tub that leaked. So yeah, most people decided it wasn't worth the effort. That being said, peasants weren't complete dirt goblins. They did wash, just not in the long-scented bubble bath way we think of today. Instead, they focused on what mattered most. The visible bits, hands, face, and sometimes feet. Everything else could wait until spring. In many villages, there was one communal washing spot, usually a river, a pond, or a public bathhouse if you were lucky. But in winter, when the water froze, washing became more of a moral dilemma than a hygiene practice. Do you risk pneumonia for clean armpits? Most chose no. Still, medieval people had a few clever tricks to keep themselves from becoming walking plagues. They brushed their teeth, no, sort of, using twigs, salt, or crushed herbs. They used linen cloths to rub themselves down, a kind of ancient sponge bath that left them freshish. And when bathing did happen, it was often a whole event. You'd fill a wooden tub in the middle of the room, heat water over the fire, and hope no one used all the hot water before your turn. Families often shared the same tub in order of importance. Father first, then mother, then children, and finally the baby, who by that point was basically being rinsed in medieval soup. But here's the thing, they didn't think this was gross. To them, dirt was part of life, a badge of labor, almost spiritual. The church even encouraged modesty by discouraging excessive bathing. You see, too much concern with one's body was considered vanity, and vanity was a sin. So ironically, smelling like a goat could make you holier. It's like saying, yes, I may reek, but at least I'm not proud. Of course, the nobility didn't exactly follow that rule. They could afford luxury baths, scented oils, and perfumes. Castles often had small bathing chambers where water was carried in by servants, dozens of buckets at a time. Imagine the poor servant walking up stone stairs all day with steaming pails, probably muttering something about quitting every 5 minutes. Wealthy lords and ladies also bathed together, which sounds risque but was often more social than sensual. Think of it like an awkward spa party, with everyone politely ignoring how cold the water got after 10 minutes. Even kings had questionable hygiene habits. Henry VIII, for example, changed his shirt several times a day because he believed linen absorbed impurities from the body, which it kinda did. He thought that wearing clean clothes was as good as washing, which, to be fair, is still a better philosophy than his marital one. The smells of medieval life were legendary. Between animals, smoke, human sweat, and waste, it was a constant sensory assault. Towns tried to manage it, but sanitation wasn't exactly advanced. Chamber pots were emptied into the street, and waste flowed down open gutters. If you lived downhill, well, congratulations. Nature's plumbing brought everything right to your door. But again, nobody really noticed. When everyone smells bad, no one smells bad. Perfume, herbs, and flowers were the medieval answer to deodorant. People carried small pouches of dried lavender, rosemary, or cloves, not because it was trendy, but because it masked the smell of being alive in the 14th century. Some even chewed parsley or mint to freshen their breath. It didn't help much, but it gave them hope. And honestly, that's half the battle. Let's not forget the role of barbers. They weren't just there to cut hair. They were also the local surgeons, dentists, and occasional therapists. A barber could bleed you, pull a tooth, trim your beard, and give you a haircut, all for a few coins. Hygiene was medicine back then. People genuinely believed that washing too often made you sick, but a nice bloodletting, that would balance your humors, which for the record, it didn't. But hey, at least your barber would chat politely while you fainted. Hair washing was another story. Peasants rarely did it. They'd brush out dirt or rub in ashes to absorb oil, then tie it back and move on with their day. Lice were such a normal part of life that everyone just accepted them. There were even special combs designed to remove them, and entire families might sit around picking bugs from each other's hair like medieval grooming monkeys. It was bonding in its own itchy way. And yet, despite all of this, medieval people didn't see themselves as filthy. The concept of clean was different. You would smell earthy, smoky, and sweaty. That was normal. What mattered was spiritual cleanliness. Sin was dirtier than mud. A pilgrim who hadn't bathed in a year could still be considered pure, while a perfumed noble with pride in his heart might be spiritually rotten. It's almost poetic if you ignore the smell. When bathhouses became more common in cities, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, people loved them. They weren't just for hygiene, they were social hubs. You'd eat, drink, gossip, maybe even flirt. Some were co-ed, which made church authorities nervous. Too many people, too much steam, too few boundaries. Eventually, as diseases spread, bathhouses got a bad reputation. By the time the Black Death rolled through Europe, bathing was practically discouraged since people thought hot water opened the pores and let the plague in. So naturally, they stopped washing altogether, because nothing says public health crisis like doubling down on grime. By the Renaissance, the pendulum swung even further. Nobles wore layers of perfume clothing instead of washing. Think 3 shirts deep and doused in rosewater. Elizabeth I famously claimed to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not, which, given Tudor plumbing, was probably fair. When Versailles was built, there were over 700 rooms and barely a handful of bathrooms. The French court was a marvel of elegance and, reportedly, smelled like a stable in summer. But again, no one thought this was strange. And yet within this fragrant chaos, there was still an elegance to survival. People made do. They adapted. They learned to cover smells with herbs, to stay warm with dirt, to find comfort in community instead of comforters. They lived close to the land, and the land clung to them in return. When you think about it, they were just human. Sweaty, smelly, messy, wonderfully human. So next time you step out of a hot shower, wrapped in a clean towel, maybe light a candle and give a tiny nod of gratitude to your medieval ancestors, who managed to keep society running while smelling like smoked onions and sheep. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, just imagine the faint sound of a wooden bucket, the splash of cold water, and someone in 1352 muttering, "That's enough bathing for this year." All right, now that we've survived the smell of medieval peasants, let's drift upward, way upward, to the fancy people on the hill, the ones in castles, the ones who never chopped wood or washed dishes, but somehow managed to make everything worse. Yes, tonight we're talking about Europe's royal families, the ultimate example of why you really should diversify your dating pool. See, while peasants were busy surviving winter with goats and prayer, royals were creating an entirely different survival problem: inbreeding. Because nothing says elite genetics like marrying your cousin for the 12th generation in a row. To medieval and early modern monarchs, marriage wasn't about love, it was about keeping the bloodline pure. Unfortunately, if you mix the same bloodline for long enough, you stop getting purity and start getting, well, Charles II of Spain. Let's start with him, because he's sort of the final boss of royal inbreeding. Born in 1661, Charles II was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and if you've ever seen his portrait, you know things did not go well. He had what historians politely call a distinctive appearance: elongated jaw, droopy eyes, and a chin that could store a week's worth of leftovers. His ancestry chart looked less like a tree and more like a spider web. Out of his 16 great-great-grandparents, he had only 6 unique individuals, which is a nice way of saying if his DNA were soup, it'd be 90% reheated leftovers. Charles was sickly from birth, couldn't walk until he was 4, couldn't talk until he was 8, and spent most of his life trying to rule a crumbling empire while barely staying conscious. His family thought marrying him off might fix things, because nothing heals centuries of genetic roulette like adding another cousin to the mix. Spoiler, it didn't work. He had 2 wives, no children, and an entire empire wondering how someone could technically be both king and court jester without trying. When Charles finally died in 1700, his will basically said, "Good luck, Europe," and sparked the War of Spanish Succession. But let's not pick on poor Charles alone. The Habsburgs were just one particularly spectacular case study. Most royal families in Europe were doing the same thing, marrying their cousins, uncles, nieces, and occasionally their nieces twice removed just to keep their crowns in the family. The logic was simple. Better a weak king from your own blood than a strong one from someone else's. Which is exactly how you end up with generations of rulers who were physically fragile, emotionally unstable, and look progressively more like the same person drawn from memory. Take, for example, Philip II of Spain, Charles's great-great-grandfather. Philip married 4 times. 2 of those wives were his cousins, and 1 was his niece. The family tree was less tree and more knot. He was known as the prudent, which might have been ironic considering his genetic choices. But it didn't stop there. The Habsburg dynasty in Austria was just as tangled. By the 1600s, nearly every European monarch was related somehow. If you threw a royal dinner party, it was basically a family reunion with crowns. Of course, the problem wasn't just Spain or Austria. France was over there doing its own weird thing. The Bourbon kings prided themselves on elegance, refinement, and the occasional disregard for reality. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, ruled for 72 years and married his cousin. His grandson, Louis XV, married his second cousin. By the time Louis XVI rolled around, the family line was so blended with European royalty that half the continent could technically claim to be his cousin too, which made the French Revolution less down with monarchy and more down with the world's most exclusive family reunion. Over in England, things weren't much better. The Tudor dynasty kept its drama more in the marry, behead, repeat category than the inbreeding one. But later, the Stuarts and Hanoverians made up for it. By the 19th century, Queen Victoria had taken intermarriage to an international level. She and her husband, Prince Albert, were first cousins. Of course they were. And they had 9 children who spread across Europe like a royal contagion. Within 2 generations, Victoria's descendants occupied the thrones of England, Russia, Germany, and Spain. This earned her the nickname the Grandmother of Europe, which sounds sweet until you realize she also spread a hereditary disease, hemophilia, to several royal lines. Her son Leopold had it, her grandson Alexis Romanov, yes, the one from the Russian imperial family, had it, and a few unlucky German and Spanish royals had it too. So the next time you think your family has bad genetics, just remember, at least no one wrote a whole medical study about it. Speaking of the Romanovs, they're a perfect example of how inbreeding and absolute power make a dangerous mix. By the early 1900s, Tsar Nicholas II was running Russia like it was still the 1600s. Slow, confused, and deeply out of touch. His wife Alexandra was another of Queen Victoria's granddaughters and a carrier of the same blood disorder. When their only son Alexei was born with hemophilia, the family panicked. Enter Rasputin, the self-proclaimed holy man who somehow convinced the royal family he could cure their son through prayer and intense staring. Spoiler, he could not. But he did manage to insert himself into Russian politics, creep everyone out, and become the most suspiciously unkillable man in history. If you ever wondered what centuries of cousin marriages and unchecked monarchy could lead to, Look no further than the fall of the Romanovs in 1917. The dynasty that began with czars marrying their relatives ended with an entire family line wiped out in a basement. Grim, but somehow poetic in a very Russian way. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, the Habsburgs were still holding on, long jaws and all. Emperor Franz Joseph I ruled Austria-Hungary for nearly 70 years, married his cousin Elizabeth, better known as Empress Sisi, and spent most of his reign watching his empire fall apart like a badly baked strudel. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a tragic suicide pact. His brother Maximilian was executed in Mexico because, yes, they tried to install an Austrian emperor there. Long story. And by World War I, the Habsburg dynasty was running on fumes and overgrown mustaches. And yet, for all their dysfunction, you have to hand it to them. They really believed in their divine right. They could be half blind, drooling, and barely able to ride a horse, but they still woke up every morning certain that God personally wanted them in the throne. Confidence like that should be studied. Of course, modern royalty has largely phased out all this genetic drama. These days, the Windsors and other surviving monarchs are much more genetically diverse. Thank global travel and public opinion for that. Marrying a commoner used to be scandalous. Now it's practically PR gold. Kate Middleton, Meghan Markle, even the Norwegian crown prince married a single mom from Oslo. Somewhere, a 17th century courtier just fainted from shock. But let's not pretend royal genetics are the only legacy here. The centuries of inbreeding left more than physical traits. They left habits, mindsets, and a deep-seated belief that the world revolved around one family name. The modern monarchy still carries that weight, even if today's scandals are more about tabloid drama than hereditary diseases. It's funny in a way. For all their power, wealth, and palaces, the royals spent centuries trapped in their own genetic loop. Meanwhile, peasants were outside, dirty, cold, but free to marry whoever they wanted. The lowborn had liberty that the highborn couldn't afford. It's the quiet irony of history. The higher you climbed, the narrower your world became. So next time someone mentions royal blood, maybe remember Charles II of Spain and his chin, or Queen Victoria's genetic domino effect, or that time the Habsburgs accidentally turned their own gene pool into alphabet soup. History loves to romanticize monarchies, the crowns, the castles, the drama. But underneath all that silk and gold was a centuries-long science experiment gone wrong. And yet we still can't look away. Maybe it's the fascination with excess, or maybe it's just comforting to know that even people born into unimaginable privilege can still make absolutely terrible life choices. So as you're drifting off, picture the royal courts, candlelit halls, velvet gowns, and a whole bunch of people who were all technically each other's cousins, pretending that was completely normal. History's most glamorous family reunion, echoing through time. All right, let's keep gliding through the candlelight of history. We've climbed from the muddy huts of peasants to the marble halls of monarchs. And, surprise, it's not that much better up here. Sure, there's silk, gold, and enough chandeliers to light a small city, but the royal life? Mostly boredom, paranoia, and food that was somehow both overcooked and cold by the time it reached your table. Because here's the thing, people imagine castles as these cozy, glittering palaces filled with laughter and feasts. In reality, they were giant stone refrigerators, drafty, echoing, and about as warm as a tomb. The tapestries on the walls, those weren't for decoration. They were basically medieval insulation. And even then, the wind still howled through the corridors like a ghost with lung problems. Let's start with the basics. Royal comfort, or lack thereof. Heating was primitive. Fireplaces existed, yes, but they mostly heated the wall directly in front of them. If you were standing anywhere else in the room, tough luck. The royals wore layers upon layers of clothing, which sounds glamorous until you realize that most of it never got washed. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Even Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most sophisticated monarchs of her age, was rumored to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not, which frankly, she did. And don't get me started on the beds. You'd think the kings and queens of Europe would sleep like royalty. Soft mattresses, fluffy pillows, servants fanning them with peacock feathers. In reality, the mattresses were stuffed with hay, horsehair, or straw, and occasionally came with a free sample of bed bugs. They slept sitting halfway upright too, because people believed lying flat would cause your blood to rush to your head and kill you. So imagine spending your nights propped up like a corpse in rehearsal. Now about the food. Royal kitchens were impressive. Massive fireplaces, entire teams of cooks, and enough spices to bankrupt a village. But the food itself, not great. Meat was oversalted, vegetables were boiled into mush, and refrigeration was a fantasy. So when a royal banquet took place, the dishes had been sitting around for hours by the time they reached the high table. Cold soup wasn't a trend. It was just reality. Of course, no royal ever admitted that the food was bad. You had to pretend to enjoy everything because insulting the cook might be treason adjacent. And besides, you didn't eat to enjoy yourself. You ate to perform. Meals were political theater, a show of wealth, etiquette, and rank. You didn't sit wherever you wanted, you sat according to your birthright. You didn't speak freely, you spoke when spoken to. Imagine a dinner party so stiff that you could get executed for using the wrong spoon. Let's not forget privacy, or the total lack of it. The concept of personal space didn't really exist in royal courts. Servants dressed you, bathed you, and even followed you to the bathroom. And yes, the bathroom situation was medieval. Literally, chamber pots under the bed, toilets were rare, and when they existed, they were just stone seats over a hole that emptied into the moat. So yes, that romantic castle view with water shimmering in the moonlight, you were probably looking at centuries of royal waste. The irony is, the higher your rank, the less freedom you had. Kings and queens were constantly surrounded. Courtiers, guards, attendants, ladies in waiting, priests, ambassadors, all watching, whispering, and judging. Every move was political. Every smile could be misinterpreted. A prince couldn't sneeze without someone wondering what it symbolized. The palace wasn't a home, it was a gilded surveillance chamber. Take Marie Antoinette, for example. Queen of France, famous for allegedly saying, "Let them eat cake," which she didn't, but she might as well have. Her mornings began with a ceremony called the levee, the royal wake-up routine. Imagine being half asleep while a line of courtiers files in to watch you get dressed, each person performing a specific task based on rank. One person handed her stockings, another her shift, another her corset. The highest-ranking lady of the room had the honor of handing her the dress. It took hours, and if the queen sneezed or dropped something, it became gossip fodder for the entire court by lunchtime. Marie Antoinette eventually had enough and created her own little escape, a faux village called the Petit Trianon, where she'd dress up as a shepherdess and pretend to live a simple life milking cows. Of course, the cows were hand-washed daily and perfumed. But in her defense, she was trapped in a system where relaxing meant pretending to be poor. And speaking of royal relaxation, it didn't exist. Monarchs were walking political chess pieces. They couldn't just retire early, take a walk, or even pick a spouse they actually liked. Marriages were contracts between nations, signed in ink and consummated under observation. Literally. In many courts, the first night of marriage was witnessed by attendants to ensure the alliance was officially sealed. If that doesn't make you want to crawl into a moat and disappear, I don't know what will. Even the leisure activities weren't much better. Hunting, dancing, falconry. All great on paper, but in reality, everything was ritualized to the point of absurdity. You couldn't just shoot a deer. You had to perform the correct gestures, use the approved words, and let the king's hounds have the first bite. Dancing involved memorizing entire routines of steps and bows. Imagine the horror of tripping in front of an audience that could exile you for bad rhythm. And behind all the ceremony, there was loneliness. Royals were rarely alone, but they were often isolated. Everyone around them wanted something: power, favor, money. Genuine friendship was rare, trust even rarer. If you were too kind, you were manipulated. Too strict, you were hated. Rulers like Louis XIV, who lived surrounded by thousands of courtiers at Versailles, often ate alone. His meals were public events, yet deeply solitary. People bowed as he chewed. Now let's add superstition to the mix. For all their wealth, most monarchs were terrified of curses, omens, and prophecies. If someone sneezed during a coronation, it could ruin their week. If lightning struck a palace, it was a divine warning. The Tudor court once believed that comets predicted royal deaths. Spoiler, sometimes they were right, but only because royal life expectancy wasn't great to begin with. Take Charles VI of France, for example. Poor man went mad, literally. One day in 1392, he just snapped, attacked his own knights, and ran screaming into the forest. For the rest of his life, he believed he was made of glass. He refused to let people touch him and wore reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter. His doctors, of course, prescribed the medieval version of therapy: prayer, cold baths, and occasionally bleeding. None of it helped. Then there was King Henry VI of England, another case study in royal burnout. Pious, quiet, and completely unsuited for politics. He spent years alternating between catatonic silence and nervous breakdowns. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, basically ran the kingdom for him, which predictably made half the nobles furious. Cue civil war, betrayal, and eventually Henry getting locked in the Tower of London. So yes, even royalty had mental health issues. They just didn't call them that. And perhaps the most poetic misery of all, the royal curse of succession. Every monarch's life revolved around producing heirs, ideally male ones. A queen's worth was measured in fertility, a king's in the number of surviving sons. And if your child died, which they often did, you were expected to grieve quietly and try again, because the crown came first, feelings later. Queen Anne of England is a heartbreaking example. She was pregnant 17 times. Only 5 babies were born alive. Only one child survived past infancy, and he died at age 11. By the time she became queen, she was physically and emotionally exhausted, but the court still pressured her to keep trying. The irony? When she died, The crown passed to a distant cousin from Germany, someone she'd never even met. Centuries of effort, and it all ended with a stranger taking the throne. So yes, royal life was luxurious on the surface. Jewels, gowns, portraits, the whole glittering illusion. But underneath, drafts, loneliness, stale meat, and a constant fear that someone was about to poison your wine. The peasants may have frozen in the fields, but at least they weren't trapped in a cage made of gold leaf and etiquette. At least they could laugh, love, and live without wondering if their servants were spying for the Duke of whoever. History has a funny way of hiding that. When we picture kings and queens, we see crowns and thrones. But maybe the truer image is someone sitting alone in a cold hall, surrounded by portraits of long-dead relatives, wondering if any of it was worth it. And yet here we are, centuries later, still fascinated, still watching documentaries, reading biographies, making YouTube videos about their glittering misery. Because somewhere in all that grandeur and gloom, we see a reflection of ourselves, just colder, fancier, and with a much worse heating system. Hey again, still awake? Good. Or maybe not good, depending on why you're here. If you've drifted halfway into sleep already, just let this next story wash over you like soft candlelight on old portraits. Tonight, we're gliding gently from the damp castles of medieval Europe into the perfume-soaked salons and suffocating corridors of royal womanhood, where diamonds sparkled and misery was an accessory. We'll start with one of the most melancholy queens ever to exist, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. Now, Sisi wasn't your typical royal. She was beautiful, yes, like fairy tale beautiful. But she also hated court life, loathed etiquette, and treated the Austrian Empire like a very large, very boring boarding school. Born into Bavarian nobility in 1837, she was the kind of teenager who liked long walks, poetry, and avoiding people. She loved horses more than humans, and her idea of fun was galloping through forests with her hair loose, which, by the way, was famously floor-length. It took hours to brush, and she refused to let anyone cut it. Maids dreaded hair day like it was Judgment Day. At 16, Sisi got engaged to Emperor Franz Joseph, the most dutiful, serious man in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was head over heels for her, but she was politely confused by the whole situation. One day she was feeding her dog, the next she was empress. And from that moment on, she was trapped in layers of satin, rules, and expectations thicker than any corset. The Viennese court was rigid. Think less romantic ballroom and more bureaucratic nightmare with chandeliers. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, basically ran everything, including Sisi's household, her children, and her emotions. When Sisi gave birth to her first child, Sophie took the baby away and raised it herself. The reason? Apparently the Empress was too frivolous to be a mother, because nothing says love like having your baby confiscated by your mother-in-law. Sisi retreated into isolation, traveling constantly, writing melancholic poetry, and obsessing over her beauty. She weighed herself daily, maintained a diet that consisted mostly of milk and broth, and spent hours doing gymnastics in her private chambers. Her waist measured 19 inches, smaller than some modern lamp bases. People worshipped her image, but behind the mirror she was quietly fading. By middle age, she became a ghost in her own empire, wandering Europe incognito, dressed in black veils, seeking peace she never found. In 1898, While walking along the shores of Lake Geneva, she was stabbed by an Italian anarchist. The weapon? A sharpened nail file. Cece didn't even realize she'd been mortally wounded at first. She just kept walking until she collapsed. Her final words were, "What happened to me?" which honestly sums up her entire life. From there, let's drift across time and oceans to another woman who blurred the line between art and agony, Frida Kahlo. Now, technically, Frida wasn't royalty, but she might as well have been. The queen of self-portraiture, the empress of pain turned into paint. Born in Mexico in 1907 or 1910, depending on which birth year she wanted that day, she sometimes changed it to align with the Mexican Revolution. Frida's childhood was already marked by illness. At 6, she contracted polio, leaving her with a limp. But she was strong-willed, mischievous, and completely unfiltered. Then at 18 came the accident, the one that defined her life. A bus collided with a streetcar, and Frida's body was nearly destroyed. A metal handrail impaled her abdomen and exited through her pelvis. She broke her spine, pelvis, ribs, leg, and collarbone. She spent months immobilized, staring at the ceiling, wrapped in plaster and pain. Most people would have given up. Frida picked up a paintbrush. She started painting herself. Because, as she said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her portraits were raw, surreal, unapologetically honest. She painted her broken body, her miscarriages, her surgeries, her heartbreaks. Every painting was a quiet rebellion against pity. And then there was Diego Rivera, the famous muralist, 20 years older, twice her size, and already married, at least once. Their relationship was part love story, part demolition derby. They adored and betrayed each other in equal measure. Frida had affairs with men and women. Diego had affairs with, well, practically everyone. They divorced, remarried, and continued orbiting each other like two stubborn planets with matching chaos. Frida's health never fully recovered. She underwent more than 30 surgeries, lost part of her leg to gangrene, and lived in chronic pain. But she kept painting, from her bed, from a wheelchair, from the very edge of her strength. When doctors told her she couldn't attend her own exhibition, she had her bed carried into the gallery instead. She died in 1954 at 47. Her last, that someone else, was Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than Henry. Catherine, poor thing, had to watch her husband dote on his mistress for years. Diane even decided what the queen wore. Imagine being queen and having your rival choose your outfit. That's the kind of humiliation only royalty could normalize. But Catherine wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. For the first 10 years of her marriage, she couldn't conceive, and everyone blamed her. People whispered that she was cursed, or that her womb was cold, whatever that means. But eventually, with some medical assistance, which included various questionable potions and maybe some astrological advice, she gave birth to 10 children. When Henry II died in a jousting accident, because of course he did, Catherine took power. Her sons were weak, her court was divided, and France was on the brink of religious war. So Catherine did what any grieving mother and newly minted political mastermind would do. She manipulated everyone. She played Protestant against Catholic, friend against foe, keeping herself in control as France burned with tension. Some even blamed her for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a night of mass killing in 1572 that left thousands dead. Historians still debate her involvement, but her reputation was sealed. To her enemies, she was the Black Queen, poisoner, witch, schemer. And maybe she was all of that. Or maybe she was just a woman trying to survive in a world where power was always borrowed, never owned. Either way, Catherine's story reminds us that behind every evil queen trope is usually someone cornered by circumstance, and often by men who underestimated her. Let's float now toward another sorrowful figure, one whose life was gilded but deeply cursed, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. You know, the last Romanovs, the family whose end was so dramatic that it basically launched a century of conspiracy theories. Alexandra was born a German princess, shy and intensely religious. When she married Nicholas, she genuinely loved him, which, to be fair, was rare among royals. But love didn't make life easier. Russia was a crumbling empire held together by denial and autocracy. The people wanted reform. The royals wanted everyone to stop complaining. Then came the birth of their only son, Alexei, who was heir to the throne, and a hemophiliac. His blood didn't clot. A single bruise could kill him. Alexandra was consumed with anxiety, desperate for anything that could save him. Enter Rasputin, the wandering mystic, self-proclaimed holy man, and absolute PR nightmare. Rasputin seemed to help the boy through sheer placebo effect, or hypnosis, or dumb luck, depending on who you ask. Alexandra saw him as a miracle. Everyone else saw him as a scandal in human form. He drank, he bragged, he flaunted his influence. And the more the public hated him, the more Alexandra clung to him.
When revolution came in 1917, it swept the Romanovs out of their golden bubble and into captivity. The rest, as you probably know, ended in tragedy in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Alexandra's letters from captivity are haunting, gentle, naive, still hoping for mercy. She never really understood how much her world had already vanished. So, what do all these women have in common? Cece, Frida, Catherine, Alexandra. Different centuries, different crowns, same invisible chains. Beauty, duty, power, pain, always tangled together. Society worshipped them, then punished them for existing too vividly. Each of them became a kind of myth, the tragic beauty, the dangerous queen, the cursed empress, the tortured artist. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. Their suffering became aesthetic. But tonight, maybe we can remember them a little differently. Not as icons, not as symbols, but as women who kept breathing, sometimes barely, in lives that didn't belong entirely to them. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. Let's drift now to our next chapter in this twilight journey, where we'll leave the courts and palaces behind and walk quietly into the fields again, back to the villages, the fog, and the everyday souls who carried history on their frost-bitten backs.